Labour has never done well in a UK election without doing really well in Scotland.
We need deposit ATMs and we need withdrawal ATMs, and we need a law that means that businesses have to accept cash.
UK workers have had the most bargaining power essentially since the 1970s because the jobs market is so tight.
Can Britain actually afford to maintain a global military presence?
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to the programme. It's been a weekend of tears and recriminations, and not just in my voice, that you can hear, not just about HS2, which we'll talk about in a moment, but also some Tory donors, or perhaps former Tory donors, that strangely, Caroline, sparked a streak of nostalgia in you.
It did. This is the
not
businessman.
Because you've been a recipient of money from
No,
this person.
no, absolutely not. But because I'm thinking about John Caudwell, who is the billionaire businessman. Yes, I did have a moment of recalling that Phones for You, which was obviously one of the businesses that he created, but the kind of the one that made his fortune, is the place where I bought my first mobile phone. I believe it was on the Euston Road. Don't quote me, but I think it definitely was from there. Back in the mists of time. No, look, he's
back when he was a Tory party donor, which he may no longer be, by the sounds of things. After the weekend comments that we had from the businessman saying that he won't back Rishi Sunak because of his net zero stance, calling it madness. Take a listen.
If we can make a real business out of environmental technology, we can create hundreds of thousands of jobs, lead the world, and increase Britain's GDP massively. And with that, the average person's standard of living goes up, and we help to save the world. I just don't understand the thinking that goes behind this at all.
So, Caudwell, of course, he donated £500,000 to the Conservative Party before the 2019 election. The thing is, he's not been entirely positive about Keir Starmer either. In recent newspaper articles, he hasn't talked about him being the most charismatic leader. So then the question was, well, if you're so frustrated with Rishi Sunak, would you donate to Labour? The Times report him saying, I will support any party that I believe will do the right thing for Britain going forward. So to my mind, it feels like maybe this very big political donor is up for grabs.
Yeah, and of course this all over the shift in position from the Prime Minister over rolling back some of the commitments to reduce emissions. They're doing things like pushing back the ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles by 5 years as well. This, of course, all at a time when donors are very much in focus as we're in party conference season. We'll be talking about the Lib Dems in a moment, but the idea that, really parties are trying to court as much business as possible at this moment of showcasing of their policies and their support.
Look, we're days away from the conferences, right? And I think it's fascinating that there are big corporate names who are going to attend the Labour Party conference in a couple of weeks' time. Goldman Sachs, Barclays, Vodafone, Google. Just last week, dropping into my letterbox, of course, was the pack of the Labour Party conference. I'm also going to the Conservative Party conference, but the Labour one. But it's interesting that it does seem that Keir Starmer and his Chancellor Rachel Reeves do seem to have attracted quite a lot of business attention, more than in previous years.
Now, if you haven't been brushing up on your railway puns, perhaps it's time for you to do so, as we're still talking about HS2. Has it been derailed? Is there further difficulties to come down the line? We've heard it from an increasingly long list of politicians over the weekend, including the former Prime Ministers Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Gordon Brown, all warning the government against scaling back High Speed 2. Speaking this morning, the Housing Minister Rachel Maclean said that it's right that the government is looking at the project, given the rising costs. Joining us now to discuss is Allan Cook, who was the former chairman of HS2, resigned in 2021. He's now chairman of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. Allan, great to have you with us on the programme. You've said, writing in the Times this morning, that the HS2 scaling it back would be a betrayal of the North and of the UK's growth ambition. Why?
HS2 has always been about, I think, four factors. It's always been about connectivity. It's always been about capacity. It's always been about the carbon footprint and the reduction of the carbon footprint. And it's always been about how we can actually develop the skills that we need, not only for existing infrastructure programs and projects, but also for the future. And that's why, from my point of view, any scaling back of HS2 would indeed be, I think, something that is to be avoided. We have to pursue a route into developing the links between the south and the north and the east and the west, and the Northern Powerhouse Rail program and HS2 are inextricably linked. So actually curtailing, if that is what the government intends to do, curtailing the program at Birmingham, I think would be an error of judgment, and I think we should be avoiding that.
It's pretty extraordinary and remarkable that so many former Tory leaders, from Cameron to Heseltine to Hammond to Johnson, plus business leaders like the former CEO of Siemens, 10 university vice-chancellors, they are all against this, and also furthermore sounding so frustrated with the Sunak government. I mean, this is quite an extraordinary moment, isn't it?
It is. It's quite, I think, unparalleled in history. If we look back at the success that we've had from HS, success that we've had of the Elizabethan line, Crossrail, going back even to M25, we can see the economic benefits that this will bring in the long term. And I think that, unfortunately, what this government appears to be doing is looking at a short-term situation and ignoring the long-term benefits of what HS2 can bring, not only to the Midlands, but to the north and indeed to the south. So this is a connectivity issue. It's a connectivity opportunity for us, and it's not surprising to me anywhere that the former prime ministers of both major parties, Labour and the Conservative, are actually very frustrated and very vocal about the need for us to pursue this with renewed vigour.
But the government's argument is that the costs involved are absolutely huge. A project that started out looking like it was going to cost less than £40 billion, now it's over £100 billion. Is the government not right, given the massively escalating cost, to review how the money is being spent?
I think we should be clear about one thing. The figures at 2019 from information that I have is just over 70 billion, whichever way you said, it is a significant amount of money. So I'm not arguing against that at all. But I think we have to look at what the situation has changed considerably since 2009 when this program was first started. So we have to look at it in terms of what was the situation way back then and what we have now. And I think that, unfortunately, because of a number of factors, some of which are linked to actually the cost of living, some of which are due to inflation, some of which are due to actually the whole situation of the supply chain, have impacted the program in terms of the overall cost. But even when you look at the overall cost, at the 71 billion that we were talking about, if you look at that in the long term, over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years and beyond, the payback is going to be absolutely considerable in terms of economic value, in terms of capacity, in terms of making it easier for businesses and people to move around comfortably. And I think that's something that we forget when you look at the east-west situation. The Northern Powerhouse has said considerably that we're dealing with an antiquated Victorian style of rail network in the north, and I think that for the long term, that has to be a situation that we have to correct.
What do you think this debate then shows or highlights about the UK's attitude to public investment? I mean, there's a great deal of discussion about trying to grow the economy for the long term. What do you think that this shows in your view? I mean, how optimistic can you be about any other future projects of this sort of scale?
I remain a disappointed optimist. I remain optimistic about the future. As you mentioned at the beginning there, I'm the chairman of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. And when I look around at some of the opportunities that we see through business, through universities, and indeed through the support that we get from the government, I am very optimistic about what we can do. However, we have to take a longer term view on these infrastructure programs. It can't be all about short-term gains. There will be a level of investment. We knew that right away from the beginning when we started off on this program. And to actually curtail the program now, either by reduction of the Birmingham to Manchester leg, or indeed having the terminus at Old Oak Common rather than Euston, is, in my mind, very, very short-minded. And I think the government need to look at this situation for the long term.
So do you think Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives have lost businesses and commuters' votes over this?
I would say that when you look at the communication and the media that we've seen over the past weekend or the past 2 or 3 days, and indeed today, I think there not only are politicians and business people concerned, but the electorate are concerned too. And they're concerned because they want to see not only their future, but their children's future and their grandchildren's future being allowed to develop effectively by providing these improved network of transport that we desperately need in the north, we desperately need within the UK to help us to actually grow our economy. We cannot grow the economy to the level at which we want to do unless we have a strong infrastructure in place to help us to actually effectively communicate across the north, south, east, west.
So how do you break the short-termism then? How do you get out of this cycle of us looking at a bill that's doubling or tripling depending on the estimates and just say, well, look, whatever it costs, we've just got to throw the money at it now because it's a long-term project? How do you get that argument to resonate with politicians and resonate with voters?
I don't think we should be doing, as you say, throwing money at this programme. And you said earlier on about it's right that the government should review this. We should be very, very clear. The government have and continue to review this programme very, very carefully indeed. So to actually almost insinuate that there has been no checks and balances on what has gone on is incorrect. The government are reviewing this. My view is that we have to look very carefully at where we can make efficiency savings, where we can use our innovation to help us to develop the program more effectively, and really look very closely at what we will be spending in the future. But that's an ongoing situation.
But the issues with HS2 were there and present when you were chairman. You were chairman between 2018 and 2021. The international comparisons, even at that time, for building high-speed rail were far cheaper abroad than they were in the UK. And you mentioned, the government keeping a close eye on the cost. They were doing that when you were chairman. What went wrong then? Before COVID, before the war in Ukraine, before the cost of living crisis, there were a lot of worries then that the costs were going to be enormous.
There were a lot of concerns about the overall cost of the programme. But I think when I took over as chairman in 2018, the first thing I did was do a complete review on behalf of the Secretary of State at that particular point in time on the programme itself. And I made certain recommendations to the programme and to the government about what we should be doing for the future. And my conclusion was basically that we needed to look very, very carefully at how we could be more efficient in the way that we're doing things. But the long-term benefits that we saw for the programme over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years were absolutely outweighed the increase in the level of cost. And bear in mind, we're talking about an investment that is spread out over a number of years, well over a decade when I was chairman. So yes, the programme was there. In the comparison between international are actually it's you've got to be very, very careful about what you compare. The situation, for instance, within France or in Germany are completely different to what they are within the UK.
What lessons need to be learned from this?
Well, I think the major lesson is there has to be a much more consistent and concerted view from government about the long-term programs. These programs are very, very complex, very, very difficult, and they require the absolute best skills that we can. If we constantly really move away from one position to another position, it damages our reputation. It damages the way that we actually look at things. And actually, when we're trying to recruit the very, very best people that we need in the programme, it makes them very concerned. And they're worried about the actual commitment.
So you're just saying that the Conservative government has chopped and changed. Is that the issue? That they've chopped and changed on a long-term-ish project, and that's the major problem?
I would say that the inconsistencies from the government have not helped the programme at all.
OK, Allan Cook, former chairman of HS2, now chairman of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme.
Thank you.
Wow.
Guess that noise. It is the start of conference season.
Is that starting with a thud?
Yeah, it is. And an orange hammer. It's our reporter Ellen Milligan knocking down a blue wall with a Lib Dem yellow/orange hammer. The party's been boosted by winning 4 recent elections, MPs, elections for, of course, party constituencies. And she's been at the annual conference in Bournemouth over the weekend, arguing that they might be the real kingmakers at the next general election.
And that's the party's position anyway. And Ellen joins us now for more. Ellen, aside from knocking down foam walls, which I'm sure there's a video, I've seen it. It looks like a lot of fun. How busy is the conference? How much of a buzz is there around the Lib Dems in Bournemouth?
I have to say the visuals on that video are much better than the noise that came through on audio there. The turnout pales in comparison to Labour and Tory party conferences. But in terms of lobbyists, there's obviously a lot less Lib Dem members. MPs, there's only about 15 Lib Dem MPs. But it's packed full of new councillors that they've elected since the last quite successful local elections. They're new MPs, Sarah Dyke, who won Somerton and Broome recently. And I think the most surprising thing is the amount of journalists here. There's an enormous amount of journalists from every national outlet. Which shows, and many of them, it's their first time at Lib Dem conference, even though they've been politics reporters for 5-10 years. So it shows how important journalists are placing on that kind of relationship building with the party, which, as you say, could be kingmakers at the next election.
I suppose that's the question. How could they be? What, given that it is the UK, one of the UK's smaller parties, I mean, how are they trying to stand out? And what sort of policies do you think are going to get interest? Because the Lib Dems obviously are the only of the major parties that is pro-European.
Yeah, I mean, I was been talking to some pollsters for our story in the last week about where the Lib Dems and Labour where they're similar on in terms of policy areas, and they were saying the real question is where they differ. In fact, the Lib Dems and Labour are quite similar on their approach to Brexit and Europe, and both have ruled out rejoining the EU. Davey came out with that this weekend, that they would obviously like to see more alignment with Brussels, which is what Labour also want. And you saw that footage from Keir Starmer last week about him saying he didn't want to go too far away from Brussels in the future. He wanted to realign with Brussels as much as possible. I think where they differ is definitely on housing and planning. For example, the Labour Party wants to be able to build houses on certain greenbelt areas. That's a red line for the Lib Dems. The Labour Party have a really ambitious infrastructure planning reform package of 28 billion going into renewables and onshore wind farms and nuclear power. that's something that might cause a bit of friction between the two. The Lib Dems have been the first party to commit to the triple lock into the next election. That's something Labour hasn't done. So there's areas where they do differ, but I wouldn't say dramatically so.
Of course, Ellen, the last time the Lib Dems did end up in coalition with the Conservative Party didn't end well for them. Is there, among the people that you've been speaking to there, a real appetite to be in a coalition again if the opportunity arises after the election?
I would say not. The thinking at the moment isn't about them going into a coalition with Labour. Their ambition is quite limited. They're looking at taking 30 seats at the next election, which is double the 15 they have at the moment, but half of the 60 that they got in 2010 when they did enter a coalition government with the Conservatives. But I would say the Lib Dems, they are quite realistic in their prospects. They have a clear list of seats. Dominic Raab's seat, for example, seats in Hertfordshire. You've got the Richmond, the Wimbledon seats, kind of in the surrounding home counties areas on the outskirts of London. So they're very clear on that. What is being spoken about is a kind of 2017 style where you have the Democratic Unionist Party enter a confidence and supply agreement with Theresa May's government. So if the Labour Party get a minority government in and they need to rely on more votes to get the key bits of legislation through Parliament, they would rely on, say, 30 of those MPs in the Liberal Democrats to vote in support of their legislation in order to pass that. That's the kind of relationship that people are talking about here this week.
Okay, what about by-election excitement? I mean, there are two upcoming in October in Rutherglen and Hamilton, which is just outside Glasgow, and also in mid-Bedfordshire. That's on the 19th of October. Why is that going to be so important? What will happen in terms of Labour and the Lib Dems then?
Well, the mid-Bedfordshire by-election is actually becoming really toxic between the Lib Dems and Labour. I mean, it's got really personal. I think there's been legal notices issued. But Labour is saying that the Lib Dems are running a vicious campaign, really personally attacking their candidate. Lib Dems are saying Labour need to get out of the seat because we've got the best shot. In fact, the polls show that Labour have the best shot, but what the Lib Dems say is that Labour have reached their ceiling. They've got control of the council, the Lib Dems do, so they've got a better chance. And what you could see is that the Tories actually slip through and hold that seat because the Lib Dems and Labour are splitting the vote. What I think will happen is, if that does happen, the Lib Dems and Labour will kind of go back to the drawing board and you won't necessarily see Starmer and Davies sitting down for a lunch meeting the next day, but there'll be some kind of informal conversations happening at a lower level of like, how do we prevent this from happening again? If our ultimate goal is to take seats from the Conservatives and we're preventing each other from doing that.
Yeah, because that strategic kind of voting system that's been operating through many of the by-elections recently has been a really interesting part of the dynamic where we've seen those parties, one step back for the other in situations where the goal is to beat the Tories. That kind of shift in narrative around Bedfordshire could be very important. Is there any sense that perhaps the strategic alliance could hold even as we get closer to a general election, or do you think will all bets be off once it comes to a national poll?
It's funny, there was a big video that was unveiled at the start of conference this week. Steve Coogan and Carroll Vorderman calling for PR, the proportional representation of the voting system, which allows smaller parties and allows more tactical voting, something that the Lib Dems have been calling for, and a certain wing of the Labour Party. And tactical voting has lent well to the Lib Dems, particularly, as you say, in by-elections. But as you say, in a general election, people ultimately vote for who they want to be Prime Minister. And tactical voting doesn't happen nearly as much, especially when you've got the polls where they are at the moment. Labour may well have got 5% of the vote share in certain Lib Dem Tory swing seats, but with the polls where they are at the moment, you might see them getting 15% of the vote share, maybe 20%. That could be enough for the Lib Dems not to be able to take a seat. For example, 2017 in Richmond, the Tories held on to that, I think, by under 1,000 votes because the Labour had a Labour Party had a bigger share than was expected, so prevented the Lib Dems from taking it. So yeah, I definitely think they know as well that there is a difference in voters' mindset in a general election versus by-election.
Okay, Ellen, thank you so much for being with us. That is Bloomberg's reporter Ellen Milligan there, reporting for us from the Lib Dems conference.
Setting up our conference season. It started with a seagull and apparently a thud as Ellen knocked over that foam wall of
and a kayak, don't forget.
I mean, it's all about the props, really, at the Lib Dems. We're all looking out for. But of course, this is the start of conference season, so we'll be bringing you more from Labour and the Tories in the coming weeks as well as they gather for those conferences. But this is the setting out of the stall. We're starting to see that crystallisation of policies and, as we've been talking about as well, the kind of drawing on where the support is coming from for these parties as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock. Our audio engineer was Rich Sabnani. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.